While on vacation at a luxury resort, the millionaire froze when he saw the housekeeper. She looked identical to his beloved who disappeared 24 years ago. Richard Caldwell frowned at the quarterly report spread across the mahogany conference table. The numbers were excellent. They always were. But something felt hollow about another record-breaking quarter. At 57, he'd built Caldwell Hospitality into the most prestigious hotel chain in the country. Yet satisfaction remained elusive. As you can see, Richard, the Tokyo expansion exceeded projections by 18%. Diana Caldwell's manicured finger tapped the spreadsheet. His wife of 20 years smiled, her perfectly applied lipstick matching her power suit. The board is thrilled. Richard nodded absently, a dull throb beginning behind his right eye. 25 years ago, he might have celebrated, before Eleanor. Richard, did you hear what I said about the Singapore property? Diana's voice sharpened. Yes, of course. He massaged his temple. The permits came through. The throbbing intensified. Strange. He never got headaches. As CFO Wilson droned on about tax advantages, the conference room lights seemed suddenly too bright. Richard loosened his tie, the silk suddenly constricting. Are you all right? Diana's perfectly sculpted eyebrows knitted together. Fine, he muttered, reaching for his water glass. His fingers wouldn't cooperate. The glass tipped, spilling across the financial reports. Richard, Diana's voice sounded distant, underwater. He tried to stand, but the room tilted violently. Someone gasped. His right arm hung uselessly at his side. When he tried to speak, only garbled sounds emerged. Call an ambulance. Diana's command pierced the fog enveloping him. I think he's having a stroke. Richard collapsed, the plush carpet rushing up to meet him. As darkness closed in, a face flashed in his mind. Not Diana's, but Eleanor's. Eleanor as he'd last seen her 33 years ago, eyes filled with tears, begging him not to leave. The MRI confirms a small ischemic stroke, Dr. Christopher Hayes explained 3 days later in Richard's hospital room. You're incredibly lucky, old friend. No permanent damage, but it's a warning shot across the bow. Richard sat propped against pillows, hating the hospital gown. The monitors, the weakness. Christopher had been his personal physician for decades, their friendship dating back to medical school. Christopher's, not Richard's. When can I return to work? Richard demanded. Diana, immaculate despite her bedside vigil, exchanged glances with Christopher. That's not happening anytime soon. Darling, Diana's right, Christopher agreed, checking Richard's vitals. Your blood pressure is still concerning. You need complete rest, no work, no stress, no arguments. He smiled tightly. Doctor's orders. I can't just disappear for weeks, Richard protested. The London deal. I'll handle London, Diana interrupted smoothly. I've already rescheduled your meetings. The company won't fall apart without you for a month. Richard glared at them both. A month. Minimum? Christopher confirmed. Somewhere peaceful, not at home where you'll sneak work calls. Diana brightened. What about the Malibu property? The presidential suite overlooks the ocean. It's perfect for recovery. Richard started to object, then stopped. Maybe some time away would help since the stroke. His dreams had been filled with Eleanor. Strange, fragmentary memories he'd thought long buried. Fine, he relented. 1 month, Diana smiled victoriously. I'll make the arrangements, after she left to call the resort. Christopher lingered, checking Richard's medication chart. You really are lucky, Richard, he said quietly. These mini-strokes can sometimes affect memory, trigger strange thoughts. I'm fine, Richard said sharply. Of course. Christopher nodded. I'll prescribe something to help you sleep at the resort. And something for anxiety. I don't need... Humor me, Christopher interrupted, writing in Richard's chart. These episodes can be disorienting. You might experience confusion, even flashbacks to stressful periods. Richard stared at his oldest friend. Something in Christopher's tone seemed off. What aren't you telling me? Christopher's smile didn't reach his eyes. Just looking out for you? We can't have the great Richard Caldwell dwelling on ancient history when he should be recovering, can we? Later that evening, Diana stood at the hospital room window, phone pressed to her ear, speaking in hushed tones while Richard pretended to sleep. He's stable, but Christopher's concerned. Yes, I know it was 33 years ago, but the stroke, brain chemistry? No, of course not. But Christopher says these episodes can trigger buried memories. We're sending him to Malibu. Yes, Azul Resort. It's isolated, controlled. I'll oversee his medication personally. Don't worry, I've handled worse. She ended the call as Richard shifted, immediately switching to her caring wife persona. But his mind was spinning. What memories was she afraid might surface? 1 week later, Richard stood on the balcony of the Azul Resort's presidential suite, watching waves crash against pristine Malibu sand, beautiful and empty, like his life, a life he'd built after Eleanor vanished. Eleanor, after 3 decades. Why couldn't he let her go? They'd been so young. He, 24 and heir to the Caldwell Hotel fortune. She, 19, the gardener's daughter with dreams of becoming a botanist. Their romance had been doomed from the start. His father had made that abundantly clear. Then she'd disappeared without a trace, and Richard had buried himself in building his empire. A soft knock interrupted his thoughts. "Your lunch, Mr. Caldwell." "Come in," he called, turning from the ocean view. The door opened, and a young woman entered carrying a tray. Something about her profile made Richard's heart stutter as she turned. Time seemed to freeze. Dark chestnut hair pulled back in a practical bun, delicate features with high cheekbones, and those eyes, amber flecked with gold, just like Eleanor. The name escaped before he could stop it. The young woman looked confused. "No, sir. I'm Natalie. I'm covering room service today." She set down the tray, concern crossing her features. "Are you feeling all right, Mr. Caldwell? You look pale." Richard gripped the balcony railing for support, his legs suddenly weak. It was impossible this woman, Natalie, couldn't be more than 30, but the resemblance to Eleanor was uncanny, down to the tiny mole near her left eyebrow. "I'm fine," he managed. "You just remind me of someone." She smiled politely. "I hope you enjoy your lunch, sir. The chef prepared it specially with your dietary restrictions in mind." As she turned to leave, Richard noticed a small scar on her right forearm, identical to Eleanor's birthmark. "Wait," he called, his voice hoarse. "Have we met before?" "I don't believe so, Mr. Caldwell." A flicker of wariness crossed her face. "I've worked here for 3 years, but usually in housekeeping, not room service." After she left, Richard sank into a chair, his lunch forgotten. It wasn't possible. The resemblance, the birthmark. His hand trembled as he reached for his medication. Maybe Christopher was right. The stroke was affecting his mind, making him see ghosts. But as he swallowed the pills, another memory surfaced. Eleanor telling him she was pregnant, her eyes shining with joy and fear, a memory he'd buried so deeply, he'd almost convinced himself it never happened. Outside his window, an elderly woman tended the resort's gardens, her wide-brimmed hat obscuring her face. For a moment, she paused, looking up toward his balcony, then quickly turned away. Richard rubbed his eyes. He was losing his mind. But one thing was certain. He needed to know more about Natalie. Richard barely slept that night. Each time he closed his eyes, Eleanor's face morphed into Natalie's, their features overlapping in a dizzying blend that left him gasping awake, sheets damp with sweat. By dawn, he'd abandoned sleep altogether and sat on the balcony, watching the sun rise over the Pacific. "You're imagining things," he muttered to himself. The stroke, the medication, but deep down, he knew this wasn't just coincidence. The resemblance was too perfect, the birthmark too precise. He picked up his phone, hesitating before dialing. After 3 rings, a gruff voice answered. "Malone Investigations." "Frank, it's Richard Caldwell." "Mr. Caldwell, been a while. Last job was..." "What?" "That background check on the CFO candidate." Richard cleared his throat. "I need something discreet. An employee at Azul Resort in Malibu. First name Natalie. Probably late 20s or early 30s. I need everything. Background, family, where she grew up." "Any particular reason?" Frank asked, the professional caution evident in his tone. "Personal interest only." A pause. "All right, I'll need a few days." "Anything specific you're looking for?" Richard gripped the phone tighter. Her birth records, and any connection to a woman named Eleanor Bradford who disappeared 33 years ago. After ending the call, Richard showered and dressed, determined to maintain some semblance of normalcy. He couldn't avoid the resort staff forever, especially if he wanted to learn more about Natalie. Later that morning, Richard ventured to the resort's restaurant, strategically choosing a table with a view of both the entrance and the gardens. He wasn't disappointed when, 30 minutes into his black coffee and untouched omelet, Natalie emerged from a side door carrying fresh towels toward the pool area. He observed her interactions with guests. Warm, efficient, but with a reserve that suggested natural shyness rather than professional distance. Once she laughed at something a child said, the sound striking Richard like a physical blow. Eleanor's laugh, musical and genuine. His coffee cup clattered against its saucer. "Mr. Caldwell, is everything all right?" The restaurant manager appeared at his elbow. "Yes, fine," Richard managed. "Actually, I was wondering about one of your employees. Natalie, I believe. The young woman who brought my lunch yesterday." The manager's expression grew carefully neutral. "Natalie Harris is one of our best staff members. Has there been a problem with the service?" "No, quite the opposite. She was extremely professional. I just wondered, is she from around here?" "I'm not at liberty to discuss our employees' personal information," the manager replied smoothly. "But I can assure you she's been with us for 3 years with an exemplary record." Richard nodded. Retreating. Too direct. He would need to be more subtle. Outside, he spotted the elderly gardener again, methodically pruning roses near the pool area. Something about her movements seemed familiar. The careful precision, the gentle handling of each bloom. As he approached, she stiffened slightly but didn't look up. "Beautiful garden," Richard offered. "You must have been working here a long time." "Long enough." Her voice was low, with a slight rasp. She kept her face angled away, the wide-brimmed hat creating a shield. "I've always admired people who understand plants," Richard continued. He stopped himself. "Someone I knew was studying botany once. She could name every flower, every herb, and its use." The secateurs in the woman's hand stilled momentarily. Most people just see pretty colors. They don't understand the complexity, the healing properties. Exactly what she used to say. Richard smiled, pain lancing through him at the memory of Eleanor, patiently explaining plant classifications as they walked through his father's gardens. The woman nodded slightly and moved farther down the row of roses, clearly ending the conversation. As she turned, Richard caught a glimpse of weathered skin, deep lines around the mouth. Nothing like Eleanor, he told himself. Just an old woman who preferred plants to people. That afternoon, a sharp knock pulled Richard from a fitful nap. Another memory. Dream. Eleanor in tears, begging him not to leave her alone with his father while he went to London on business. In the dream, he'd promised to be back within a week. In reality, when he returned 10 days later, she was gone. No note, no trace. The knocking came again. Richard opened the door to find Diana standing there, designer luggage at her feet, sunglasses perched on her perfect blonde coiffure. "Surprise, darling." She smiled, brushing past him to inspect the suite. "I thought you could use some company." Richard's stomach twisted. "I thought you were handling the London negotiations." Wrapped them up early. She removed her sunglasses, eyes narrowing slightly as she assessed him. "You look terrible. Are you taking your medication?" "Of course," he lied, having flushed that morning's dose down the toilet. The pills made him foggy, dulled his thoughts, and he needed clarity now more than ever. Diana's smile tightened. "Good," Christopher called. "He's concerned about your recovery," she unpacked with brisk efficiency. "He mentioned you might experience some confusion, memories resurfacing." Richard watched her carefully. "What kind of memories?" "Oh, nothing specific. Just that stroke patients sometimes experience flashbacks to stressful periods." She paused, too casually. "You haven't been dwelling on unpleasant things. Have you, like Eleanor?" The directness of the question caught him off guard. "Why would you bring her up?" Diana shrugged elegantly. "It was a traumatic time for you. Her disappearance. Your father's disappointment." She approached, laying a cool hand on his cheek. "I just don't want you upsetting yourself over ancient history." Something in her tone raised alarm bells. The same concern Christopher had shown, as if they were afraid of what he might remember. Miles away, in a modest apartment complex on the outskirts of Malibu, Natalie Harris unlocked her door, exhaustion weighing on her shoulders after a double shift. "Mommy," 8-year-old Noah launched himself at her, his thin arms wrapping around her waist. "Ms. Parker let me help feed the classroom hamster today." Natalie smiled, dropping her purse to return the hug. "That's wonderful, sweetie. Did you take your medicine?" Noah nodded against her stomach. "Mrs. Jimenez made me take it before dinner, but I still feel tired." Concern flickered across Natalie's face as she brushed dark hair from her son's forehead. Despite his excitement, the pallor beneath his olive skin worried her. "Why don't you show me that science project while I heat up dinner?" she suggested, guiding him toward the small kitchen. She listened to Noah's chatter about school, while mentally calculating her bank balance against next week's cardiology appointment. The specialist had mentioned a new procedure, experimental, but promising. The cost made her dizzy. After tucking Noah in and checking his medication, Natalie sank onto their worn sofa, pulling a worn leather-bound book from her bag, her inheritance from Agnes, the only mother she'd ever known. The old woman's botanical knowledge had been extraordinary, and Natalie had absorbed as much as she could before Agnes passed 5 years ago. Inside the book's cover was the faded photograph Agnes had given her on her deathbed, along with the confession that had shaken Natalie's world. "You came to me when you were just a baby. I didn't give birth to you. Child, but you were meant to be mine to protect." Natalie traced the image of the young woman in the photo, beautiful, with Natalie's same amber eyes, standing beside flowering shrubs, one hand protectively over her swollen belly, the only clue to her birth mother's identity, along with the silver medal Agnes had pressed into her palm. "One day, when it's safe," Agnes had whispered cryptically, "the truth will find you." Natalie closed the book as a peculiar shiver passed through her. All day, she'd felt unsettled after her encounter with Richard Caldwell, the way he'd looked at her, as if he'd seen a ghost. 3 days after Diana's unexpected arrival, Richard found himself wandering the resort grounds with increasing restlessness. Diana shadowed him almost constantly, organizing spa treatments and chef's tastings, activities that felt more like surveillance than caregiving. On the rare occasions she took business calls, Richard seized the opportunity to explore alone. Today was one such opportunity, ostensibly heading for the beach. Richard diverted to the resort's renowned botanical gardens. Once Diana disappeared into their suite for a conference call, his steps quickened as he spotted Natalie kneeling by a bed of medicinal herbs, clipboard in hand as she inventoried plants. He approached casually, hands in pockets. "Those aren't just decorative, are they?" Natalie glanced up, surprise registering before her professional mask slipped back into place. "Mr. Caldwell? No, they're not. Azul incorporates these herbs into the spa treatments and cuisine." Richard nodded, studying the plants. Lavender for relaxation, mint for digestion. "What's this one?" He pointed to a plant with tiny white flowers. "Feverfew," Natalie replied, a hint of genuine enthusiasm warming her voice. "It helps with migraines. We dry the leaves for the spa director's special headache remedy." "You know your plants." A slight flush colored her cheeks. "My mother, my adoptive mother, was a botanical healer. She taught me everything about medicinal plants." Richard's heart quickened. "Adoptive mother?" Natalie hesitated, clearly wondering why she'd shared something so personal. "Yes, Agnes raised me from infancy." "She must have been remarkable," Richard said carefully. Sensing her discomfort, something softened in Natalie's expression. She was self-taught, but she knew more about healing plants than most doctors. "That's actually why I inventory these. I help the chef and spa director with proper usage." "A family tradition," Richard murmured. "I suppose so." Natalie looked down at her clipboard. "I should finish this before my regular shift starts." "Of course, but I'd love to hear more sometime. Maybe you could show me around the gardens. My doctor recommends peaceful activities." He smiled ruefully. "My wife has scheduled every spa treatment available, but honestly, I prefer plants to hot stones and cucumber masks." Natalie hesitated, then nodded. "I lead a garden tour for guests on Thursday mornings. You're welcome to join." As Richard thanked her and walked away, he didn't notice the elderly gardener watching their exchange from behind a nearby hedge, her weathered hands gripping pruning shears tight enough to leave marks on her palms. "You're distracted tonight," Diana observed over dinner on their private balcony. The sun set dramatically over the Pacific, bathing everything in golden light. Richard shrugged, pushing around his barely touched sea bass. Just thinking about the past. Diana set down her fork with deliberate care. That's not helpful for your recovery. Isn't it strange, Richard continued, ignoring her comment, how some memories stay buried until something triggers them? A flash of alarm crossed Diana's face before she controlled it. Christopher warned about this. The stroke can cause fixation on random memories. They don't feel random. Richard met her eyes directly. I've been remembering Eleanor, specifically our last conversation before she disappeared. Diana reached for her wine glass. Ancient history, darling. 30 years is a long time to dwell on a college romance. 33 years, Richard corrected. And there's something I can't reconcile in my memory. Eleanor was terrified of being left alone with my father while I went to London. She begged me not to go. You've never mentioned that before. Because I didn't remember it. Not clearly. Until recently. Richard studied his wife's perfectly composed face. Why would she be afraid of Edward, and why, when I returned 10 days later, had she vanished without a trace? Diana sighed with practiced sympathy. Richard, she was a gardener's daughter who got pregnant to trap a Caldwell heir. When she realized your father wouldn't allow the relationship, she ran off. The words hit like a slap. Pregnant? You never said... I assumed you knew. Diana's voice was smooth as glass. Your father told me everything when we got engaged. How this girl claimed to be pregnant. How they offered her money to disappear quietly. She reached for his hand. It's why I never pushed you about children. I knew that wound was deep. Richard pulled his hand away. Mind reeling. Diana's version contradicted his emerging memories. Eleanor, joyfully telling him about the baby. Eleanor, terrified of his father. None of it matched Diana's cold assessment. I need some air, he muttered, standing abruptly. Richard. Alone, Diana. I need to be alone. In his luxury office across town. Dr. Christopher Hayes studied Richard's latest test results with a frown. The blood work showed decreasing levels of the medication. Either Richard was metabolizing it faster than expected, or he wasn't taking it regularly. His intercom buzzed. Dr. Hayes, your 8 o'clock is here. Send her in. Diana Caldwell entered. Immaculate as always. Without preamble, she stated, He's remembering. Christopher leaned back in his chair. How much? Fragments. Eleanor being afraid of Edward? The pregnancy. Damn. Christopher tapped his pen against the desk. I warned you the stroke might disrupt the memory blocks we've so carefully maintained. Fix it, Diana demanded. It's not that simple. Memory is complex. I don't need a neurology lecture, Diana snapped. I need solutions. 33 years, Christopher. We've contained this for 33 years. Christopher sighed. I'll adjust his medication, something stronger to suppress the memory formation process. But Diana, we should consider the possibility that it's time to develop a contingency plan. No, her voice was steel. There is no contingency. Too much is at stake. Outside the door, Abigail Chen, Christopher's new nurse, quietly continued organizing patient files, her expression neutral despite having overheard fragments of the conversation. Something about the intensity of Diana Caldwell's tone troubled her deeply. That night, Richard dreamed vividly of the past. Not fragmented images, but complete scenes playing like a movie. 24-year-old Richard strolled through his family's estate gardens, pausing as he spotted a young woman he'd never seen before. She knelt among the roses, notebook open beside her, sketching a bloom with remarkable precision. You're not one of our regular gardeners, he observed. She looked up, startled, amber eyes widening. I'm Eleanor Bradford. My parents started working for your father last week. She stood quickly, brushing dirt from her jeans. I'm helping them while I'm home from college for the summer. You're in college. Richard found himself captivated by her natural beauty. No makeup, just sun-kissed skin and intelligence shining in those extraordinary eyes. Botanical studies at Berkeley? Pride colored her voice. First in my family to attend university. The conversation flowed easily, as she showed him her botanical sketches. By the time they parted an hour later, Richard knew he would find reasons to visit the gardens daily. Edward Caldwell's reaction when he discovered their blossoming relationship 3 weeks later was explosive. A gardener's daughter, he'd thundered. Have you lost your mind? The Caldwell heir doesn't dally with the help. I love her, Richard had insisted, young and defiant. Edward's face had turned dangerously calm. You'll go to London next week to handle the Harrington acquisition. By the time you return, this infatuation will be resolved. The threat in his father's voice had been unmistakable. Richard woke, gasping, the dream so vivid he could still smell the roses from his family's garden. The memories weren't invented. They were real, returning with crystal clarity after decades of suppression. He reached for his phone to check the time. 3:17 a.m., too early to call Frank for updates on Natalie's background. But the investigator had promised results soon, slipping from bed without waking Diana. Richard stepped onto the balcony. In the moonlight, he noticed movement in the gardens below. The elderly gardener, working by lamplight despite the hour, her movements deliberate as she tended to night-blooming plants. For a moment, something in her posture seemed achingly familiar. Then she straightened, adjusting her wide-brimmed hat, and the impression vanished like mist. Richard's phone vibrated as he finished breakfast. Diana was still asleep, giving him a rare moment of privacy. Caldwell, he answered quietly, stepping onto the balcony. It's Frank. Got some information on your Natalie Harris. Richard's grip tightened. Go ahead. Born Natalie Agnes Williams, apparently, raised in Sierra Madre by Agnes Williams. An elderly woman who worked as an herbalist. No father listed on any documents I could find. Mother unknown. What about birth records? That's where it gets interesting, Frank said. No hospital birth certificate. Just a delayed registration filed when she was almost 1. Agnes claimed home birth. No witnesses. Convenient way to adopt a baby without questions. Richard's pulse quickened. And Agnes Williams died 5 years ago. Before that, she worked at Cedars-Sinai as a nurse until 1992. Quit suddenly. Moved to Sierra Madre with an infant. Timeline fits your 33-year window. Any connection to Eleanor Bradford? Nothing direct. But get this. I found an old photograph in a Sierra Madre community newsletter from 2005. Shows Agnes at a farmer's market with teenage Natalie. The caption mentions Agnes's exceptional botanical knowledge, similar to what you said about this Eleanor. Richard stared out at the ocean. Send me everything. And Frank, keep digging. After hanging up, Richard sat motionless, mind racing. The pieces didn't quite fit, but they suggested a pattern. Agnes Williams, a nurse who suddenly quit her job around the time Eleanor disappeared. A mysteriously acquired baby with no birth records, botanical knowledge passed down. Diana's voice interrupted his thoughts. Who was that? Richard hadn't heard her approach. Business call. Her eyes narrowed. You promised no work during recovery? Some things can't wait. He pocketed his phone. I'm seeing a specialist today. What specialist? Christopher didn't mention. Second opinion. Richard cut her off. Dr. Daniel Foster, neurologist specializing in memory issues. Diana's composure slipped momentarily. That's unnecessary. Christopher is one of the best. The appointment's at 11. Richard stood. Don't worry, I ordered a car. As he walked past, Diana caught his arm. Richard, I'm concerned. You seem fixated on the past. He met her gaze steadily. Maybe it's time I remember what really happened. Dr. Daniel Foster's office was deliberately soothing. Soft lighting, abstract art, comfortable furniture. The neurologist himself projected calm competence, his salt and pepper beard neatly trimmed, manner direct but gentle. So, Mr. Caldwell, tell me what brings you here. Richard described his stroke, the emerging memories, his suspicions about his medication. And you feel these memories are being deliberately suppressed? Yes, Richard said firmly. My wife and longtime physician seem alarmed that I'm remembering certain events from 33 years ago, Doctor. Foster made notes. What happened 33 years ago? My first love disappeared under mysterious circumstances. I was told she left voluntarily, but my emerging memories suggest otherwise. Richard hesitated. She was pregnant with my child. Foster looked up. Have you experienced memory gaps throughout the years? I suppose. That period has always been hazy. I assumed it was emotional trauma. Or it could be dissociative amnesia, Foster suggested. Sometimes triggered by severe psychological trauma, the brain protects itself by compartmentalizing or suppressing memories. Could that last decades? In some cases, yes, especially if reinforced. Foster leaned forward. Mr. Caldwell, what medications are you currently taking? Richard showed him the pills Christopher had prescribed. Foster frowned. This is an unusual combination for stroke recovery, this one. He pointed to a small white pill. Is commonly used for anxiety. But at high doses, it can affect memory formation. So it could prevent memories from resurfacing. Potentially, I'd like to run some tests, Foster wrote on a prescription pad. In the meantime, I'm modifying your medication, and I want to see you again next week. Richard felt a strange relief. He wasn't imagining things. At Cedars-Sinai Medical Center, Abigail Chen sorted medical records in Dr. Hayes' office, troubled by the conversation she'd overheard between him and Diana Caldwell. Something about Richard Caldwell's medication didn't sit right with her. On impulse, she opened the hospital's database, searching for Eleanor Bradford. Nothing recent, but there was a patient file from 1992. Restricted access. Curious. Hayes' voice startled her. Abigail, what are you doing? She closed the screen quickly. Just organizing files, Dr. Hayes. He studied her suspiciously. I need you to prepare Richard Caldwell's new prescription. Double the anxiolytic dose. Double, Abigail questioned before she could stop herself. That's well above standard. I'm aware. Hayes cut her off. Mr. Caldwell is a special case. Do it now, please. After he left, Abigail stood frozen, facing an ethical dilemma. The dosage seemed dangerous, possibly intended to sedate rather than heal. Making her decision, she prepared 2 sets of medication, one with Hayes' instructions, another with the proper therapeutic doses. The question was which to deliver. Natalie's garden tour was small. Just Richard, an elderly couple, and a mother with 2 bored teenagers. As they walked through the resort's extensive gardens, Richard was struck by Natalie's transformation. Shy and reserved in her housekeeping role, she became animated and confident discussing plants. This section contains traditional medicinal herbs, she explained, gesturing to carefully labeled beds. Many modern pharmaceuticals originated from these plants. Digitalis from foxglove for heart conditions, willow bark containing salicin, which led to aspirin. Did you study botany formally? Richard asked. No. Regret tinged her voice. I always wanted to, but college wasn't financially possible. My knowledge is all from Agnes, my mother, and my own research. As the tour continued, Richard noticed the elderly gardener watching from a distance, pretending to work whenever anyone glanced her way. Near the end, the other guests drifted ahead, leaving Richard and Natalie momentarily alone. Your mother must have been an extraordinary teacher, Richard commented. Your knowledge rivals university training, Natalie smiled. Agnes believed healing came from understanding nature, not just books, she'd say. Plants speak to those who listen. Richard felt a jolt. Eleanor had said those exact words to him once. Did Agnes work in medicine before becoming an herbalist? He asked casually. She was a nurse at Cedars-Sinai, Natalie confirmed, but she never discussed why she left, just that she needed a fresh start. As they rejoined the group, Richard noticed Natalie absently touching a chain around her neck, partially visible beneath her uniform. Something hung from it, tucked beneath her collar. The tour ended at the orchid greenhouse, Richard lingering behind as others departed. Thank you, he said sincerely. This was more therapeutic than anything else I've tried. Plants have that effect, Natalie replied, then hesitated. Mr. Caldwell, may I ask why you're so interested in my background? It feels personal. Richard considered deflecting but chose honesty. You remind me of someone I lost long ago. Someone very important to me. Genuine compassion filled her eyes. Eleanor's eyes. I'm sorry for your loss. A text message alert interrupted the moment. Richard checked his phone. A photo from Frank showing the newsletter image of Agnes and teenage Natalie at the farmer's market. Richard's blood froze. In the background, barely visible but unmistakable, stood the elderly gardener, 30 years younger but with the same posture, same way of holding her pruning shears. He looked up sharply. Your mother's name was Agnes Williams. Natalie nodded, confused by his intensity. And was she friends with other gardeners, other botanical experts? Not really. She was quite private. There was a woman who sometimes sent letters. No return address, just plant specimens and notes. Agnes never explained who she was. Natalie took a step back. "Why are you asking these questions?" "I apologize," Richard said, realizing he'd alarmed her. "It's just..." His phone rang again. "Diana, I need to take this. Thank you again for the tour." As he walked away, Natalie pulled the chain from beneath her collar, revealing an antique silver medallion. She opened it briefly, glancing at the tiny inscription inside, words in Latin she'd never fully understood, before tucking it safely away again. That night, Richard's dreams were more vivid than ever. Not fragmented flashes, but complete scenes playing like a film he'd forgotten he'd watched. Eleanor sat on a stone bench in the Caldwell estate garden, sunlight filtering through leaves, creating dappled patterns on her sundress. Her hands rested protectively over her slightly rounded belly. "I've been offered a research position," she told him excitedly. "Professor Whitman says I can defer until after the baby comes." Richard knelt before her, taking her hands in his. "You'll be an amazing botanist and mother." "Your father will never accept this," she whispered, fear clouding her joy. "Yesterday, when you were in the city, he came to the greenhouse the way he looked at me, Richard, like I was nothing, worse than nothing, an obstacle." "I don't care what he thinks," Richard insisted. "After London, we'll announce the engagement properly. He'll have to accept it." Eleanor's grip tightened. "Don't go to London, please. I have a terrible feeling." "It's just 3 days," he promised, kissing her forehead. "4 at most." "Richard, I'm scared of him. The things he said..." "What did he say?" Richard demanded. Eleanor shook her head. "Just that Caldwells have ways of solving problems." Richard woke with a gasp, heart pounding. The memory was crystal clear. Eleanor had been terrified of his father, and he'd dismissed her fears. And his trip to London hadn't been 3 or 4 days. It had stretched to 10. By the time he returned, she was gone. Beside him, Diana stirred. "Another nightmare. Just dreams," he murmured. Mind racing. The timeline was wrong in Diana's version. She claimed Eleanor had run off after learning his father wouldn't accept the relationship. But in his memories, Eleanor already knew that, and she hadn't been planning to leave. "I'm getting water," he said, slipping from bed in the suite's kitchenette. Richard checked his phone. Another message from Frank. Found something big. Call ASAP. It was 3:17 a.m. Too late to call. Richard poured water, hands shaking slightly as more pieces began connecting. The elderly gardener at the resort, photographed with Agnes Williams years ago. Agnes, a former nurse who suddenly left her job around the time Eleanor disappeared. Natalie, raised by Agnes with Eleanor's eyes, Eleanor's birthmark, Eleanor's passion for botanical healing. "Can't sleep." Diana's voice made him jump. She stood in the doorway, silk robe perfectly arranged, watching him with calculating eyes. "Just thinking," he replied, "about Eleanor again." Diana sighed. "Richard, this obsession isn't healthy. It's not an obsession to want the truth." Diana's voice hardened slightly. "The truth is she left you, end of story." "Is it?" Richard challenged. "Because I'm remembering differently. Eleanor was excited about the baby, about our future. She was terrified of my father, not eager to leave." Diana's expression flickered before smoothing into concern. "These false memories are exactly what Christopher warned about. Stroke patients often confuse reality with..." "Stop," Richard cut her off. "You and Christopher have been remarkably aligned in your concern about my memories, almost as if you both know what I might remember." Diana stepped closer, switching tactics. "You're exhausted and stressed. Let me call Christopher. He can adjust." "My medication," Richard finished. "The medication Dr. Foster says is suspiciously high-dosed and likely suppressing my memory function." Diana froze. "What second-rate doctor has been filling your head with?" "One of the country's leading neurologists." Richard felt strangely calm now. "Diana, what really happened to Eleanor?" She recovered quickly, reaching for his hand. "Darling, you're not well. Let me help you back to bed." Richard allowed himself to be led, aware that confronting Diana directly had been a tactical error. She was now fully alerted to his suspicions. He needed to be more careful. "He's remembering more than we anticipated," Diana said sharply into her phone the next morning, standing on the beach far from the resort. "And he's consulted another neurologist." "Who?" Christopher demanded. Daniel Foster, Christopher cursed. Foster's highly respected. His assessment will carry weight. Richard's questioning everything. The timeline. Eleanor's disappearance. My knowledge of events. Diana kicked at the sand. He's getting dangerously close. Has he connected Natalie to Eleanor? He's fascinated with her, but I don't think he's made the full connection yet, though he's clearly suspicious. Christopher sighed. We need to accelerate the plan. I'm sending Abigail with his new medication today. Double dosage, as we discussed. It should significantly increase memory suppression and create mild sedation. And if that doesn't work, then we move to more permanent solutions. Diana ended the call, unaware of the elderly gardener working behind nearby dunes. Close enough to have heard every word, Natalie's modest apartment was quiet, except for the hum of the oxygen machine beside Noah's bed. His condition had worsened overnight, his lips slightly blue, despite the supplemental oxygen, his breathing more labored than usual. She checked his pulse, anxiety knotting her stomach. The specialist's words echoed in her mind. Without the surgery, his heart will continue to weaken. Natalie brushed dark hair from her son's forehead. The surgery cost was impossible. $250,000 that insurance wouldn't cover for an experimental procedure. She'd been saving every penny, working double shifts, but at this rate, she'd never have enough in time. The hospital had payment plans, but they required a substantial down payment that was still beyond her reach. She'd applied for charity programs, grants, even considered crowdfunding, but nothing had materialized quickly enough. Noah stirred, opening eyes that mirrored her own. Mom, is it morning? Almost, sweetheart. She kept her voice light. How are you feeling? Tired, he admitted. But I finished my book last night, the one about plants that can grow on other planets. Despite her worry, Natalie smiled. Noah had inherited her fascination with botany, devouring books on plants and their properties. Get some more rest, she said, adjusting his blanket. Mrs. Jimenez will stay with you while I'm at work. Once Noah drifted back to sleep, Natalie moved to the kitchen table where she'd spread out Agnes's botanical notebooks. Her mother's knowledge of medicinal plants had been extraordinary, and Natalie had been transcribing the handwritten notes, hoping to preserve the wisdom and perhaps eventually publish them. As she worked, her fingers absently traced the medallion hanging around her neck. Her most precious possession. Agnes had given it to her on her 16th birthday, explaining it had belonged to Natalie's birth mother. Keep it close, Agnes had said. Someday it might help you find answers. The inscription inside was in Latin, Amor vincit omnia, love conquers all, a strange motto for someone who had apparently abandoned her child. Natalie had never actively searched for her birth parents. Agnes's explanation, that her mother had been in danger and had left Natalie to protect her, seemed fantastical. Yet Agnes had been insistent. When the time is right, the truth will find you, she'd promised lately. Natalie had been wondering if that time was approaching. Mr. Caldwell's strange interest in her background, his questions about Agnes, it felt significant somehow. She opened the medallion again, studying the tiny photograph inside. A partial image, just the edge of a garden and what might be a woman's hand, too faded and small to reveal much. Yet she'd always treasured it. Her phone buzzed with a text from her supervisor. Need you to cover for Melissa today. Emergency double pay. Natalie sighed. She couldn't refuse the extra money, not with Noah's condition worsening. As she prepared for another long day, she tried to ignore the strange sense that something momentous was about to happen, something connected to Richard Caldwell and his haunted eyes. At the resort, the elderly gardener known to staff as Josephine worked methodically among the roses, her movements deliberate despite arthritic hands. Behind her thick glasses and beneath her wide-brimmed hat, her eyes constantly scanned her surroundings, particularly the path from the main building. When Richard appeared, walking alone toward the beach, Josephine stiffened momentarily before resuming her pruning. She'd been avoiding direct contact with him, watching from a distance as he spoke with Natalie, noting his growing suspicion and awareness. For 33 years, she'd lived in shadows, watching over the daughter she'd been forced to abandon, maintaining her distance to protect them both. Now, everything threatened to unravel because of a stroke and returning memories. Diana's phone conversation that morning had confirmed her worst fears. They were planning something permanent if the medication failed. Josephine, who had once been known as Eleanor Bradford, faced an impossible choice: maintain her cover or risk everything to warn Richard before it was too late. Dark clouds gathered on the horizon as Richard paced his suite, waiting for Frank's call. Diana had left for a spa appointment after their tense breakfast, giving him a brief window of privacy. When his phone finally rang, Richard answered immediately. "I found something critical," Frank said without preamble. "Accessed sealed records from Cedars-Sinai. 33 years ago, and Eleanor Bradford was admitted with pregnancy complications." Richard's grip tightened. What happened? Official record says she died during childbirth. Death certificate signed by Dr. Christopher Hayes. The room seemed to tilt. "Christopher, that's impossible. He was my friend. He's still my doctor." "There's more," Frank continued. "Agnes Williams was the attending nurse. She quit abruptly the next day. And here's the kicker. The infant was also reported deceased. But there's no death certificate for the baby, just a notation of complications during delivery. Are you saying—" "I can't prove it, but the timeline fits. Agnes disappears with a mysteriously acquired infant right after Eleanor allegedly dies in her care. Then there's this." Richard's phone pinged with an image. A grainy hospital surveillance photo showing a younger Christopher Hayes accepting an envelope from a woman whose profile was unmistakably Diana's. "This was taken the day after Eleanor's death," Frank explained. "Diana was Edward Caldwell's protege at the time, years before you married her." Richard sank into a chair, pieces falling into horrible alignment. "My God." "There's one more thing," Frank added. "I ran a background check on the resort gardener, Josephine Miller. Her identity only goes back 25 years before that." "Nothing?" "And look at this comparison." Another image appeared. Eleanor's college yearbook photo beside a digitally de-aged simulation of Josephine's face. Removing wrinkles and age spots, Richard stared at the unmistakable match. "Eleanor is alive," he whispered. "Seems that way," Frank confirmed. "And your wife appears to have been involved from the beginning, likely following your father's orders." Thunder rumbled in the distance as Richard ended the call. Mind reeling. Everything he'd believed about his life was built on lies. His first love hadn't abandoned him. She'd been declared dead while pregnant with his child. Christopher, his trusted friend, had signed the falsified death certificate. Diana, his wife of 20 years, had been complicit from the start. And Eleanor was alive, disguised as Josephine the gardener, watching over their daughter from a distance. The realization struck like lightning. Natalie was his child. The birthmark, the botanical knowledge, the age. It all fit. Eleanor had somehow survived. Agnes had helped her escape. And together they'd protected Natalie from whatever threat Edward Caldwell and Diana had posed. His phone buzzed with a text from Diana, taking longer than expected. "Christopher's nurse is bringing your medication at 3. Take immediately. Doctor's orders." Richard deleted the message. No more medication, no more lies. The storm broke with sudden fury as Richard made his way to the gardens, hoping to find Josephine, Eleanor, before Diana returned. Rain lashed against his face as lightning split the darkened sky, but he pressed on, driven by 3 decades of buried truth. The gardening sheds were empty. Richard checked each one, calling out Josephine, and then, more desperately, "Eleanor." Only the howling wind answered, soaked and growing frantic. He turned toward the staff quarters. If he couldn't find Eleanor, perhaps Natalie could lead him to her. He needed to tell them both everything before it was too late. Lightning flashed again, momentarily illuminating a figure standing beneath a large oak. Richard squinted through the downpour. "Eleanor." The figure didn't move. Richard approached slowly, heart pounding. "I know who you are," he called over the storm's roar. "I know what happened." The woman remained motionless, face hidden beneath her broad-brimmed hat, when Richard was just feet away. She finally looked up, removing her thick glasses, despite the aging. The weathered skin, the gray hair, those amber eyes were unmistakable. "Eleanor," he breathed. "You shouldn't be out in this storm, Mr. Caldwell," she said, clinging to her disguise even now. "Eleanor," he repeated, reaching for her hand. "I remember everything. I know what they did to you, what Christopher and Diana did, what my father orchestrated." She pulled back. You're confused. I'm just a gardener. The medallion, Richard pressed. The silver one with the Latin inscription. I gave it to you on your 20th birthday. Amor vincit omnia. Love conquers all. Eleanor's composure cracked, tears mingling with raindrops. They'll kill you if they realize you know, she whispered. They already tried once with your stroke. My stroke wasn't natural. Christopher has been adding small amounts of digitoxin to your medication for years. Not enough to kill you, just enough to eventually cause heart damage or stroke. When you survived, they increased the dosage to suppress your memories. Richard felt sick. And you've been watching all this time. I had no choice. Eleanor's voice broke. Agnes helped me escape the hospital after they declared me dead. She'd overheard Diana instructing Christopher to take care of the problem permanently. They planned to kill me and our baby. Natalie, Richard said. Our daughter. Eleanor nodded. Agnes discovered they'd placed her for adoption under a false identity. She managed to adopt her legally, and we raised her together. Agnes openly as her mother. Me as an occasional visitor, then later as the strange gardener who taught her about plants. Why didn't you come to me? I would have protected you both. Your father threatened to kill you too if I ever contacted you, Eleanor explained. He said the Caldwell empire was meant to merge with the Sinclair fortune through your marriage to Diana. No gardener's daughter would ruin his plans. Richard's knees weakened as the full horror dawned on him. And Diana. She's been watching me all these years, making sure I never remembered. They've been poisoning you, Richard. Slowly, carefully. I couldn't intervene without risking Natalie. A sharp pain suddenly tore through Richard's chest. He gasped, clutching at his shirt as the world began to spin. Richard? Eleanor's voice seemed distant. He tried to speak, but another wave of pain crashed through him. His vision tunneled, darkness creeping in from the edges. Richard? Eleanor caught him as he collapsed. No, no, no. Through the haze of pain, he saw her face above him. Rain washing away years of disguise. Tell, Natalie, he managed before everything went black. Abigail Chen hurried through the resort lobby, medical bag in hand, scanning for signs of Richard Caldwell. Dr. Hayes had been explicit. Deliver the medication personally. Ensure he took it immediately. But the pills in her bag weren't what Hayes had prescribed. After overhearing Diana's call and discovering the altered records, Abigail had made her decision. Instead of the dangerous cocktail Hayes had prepared, she carried proper therapeutic doses. She'd also contacted Dr. Foster, sharing her concerns about Hayes's treatment. Foster had promised to report Hayes to the medical board, but warned that without hard evidence it might not be enough. As Abigail approached the suite, a hotel employee rushed past. "Medical emergency in the gardens," the woman shouted into her radio. "Guest collapsed. Richard Caldwell." Abigail's heart sank. She was too late. In her office across town, Dr. Foster's assistant rushed in. "The tox screen results from Richard Caldwell's blood sample," she said, handing him the file. Foster scanned the report, face darkening. "Digitoxin," he muttered. "Call the police now." The results confirmed his worst suspicions. Richard Caldwell had been systematically poisoned. Not enough to kill quickly, but enough to cause his stroke and, at higher doses, potentially fatal cardiac events. As his assistant dialed, Foster gathered his evidence. He just hoped he wasn't too late. Outside, the storm raged on, as if nature itself was responding to the breaking of a 33-year conspiracy. Harsh white light assaulted Richard's eyes as consciousness returned in fragments. Beeping machines, antiseptic smell, urgent voices. A hospital room through blurred vision, he made out figures moving around him. Their words muffled as if underwater. Beep dropping again. Push another amp of severe digitalis toxicity. Memory flickered. The storm, Eleanor's confession. Crushing chest pain. Richard tried to speak but found a tube down his throat. Panic rose as he struggled against it. "He's fighting the ventilator," someone said. "Mr. Caldwell, you're in the hospital. Try to stay calm." A familiar face came into focus. Dr. Daniel Foster. "You've suffered cardiac arrest, likely triggered by poison in your system," Foster explained. "We're working to clear it. Blink if you understand." Richard blinked, mind clearing enough to form a coherent thought. "Eleanor, Natalie, danger." He gestured weakly, miming writing. A nurse placed a tablet in his hands. With trembling fingers, he typed, "Diana poisoned me. Find Eleanor, gardener Josephine. Protect Natalie, housekeeper." Foster read it and nodded grimly. "The police are already involved. They're looking for your wife." Relief washed through Richard before darkness claimed him again. When he next awoke, the ventilator was gone, replaced by an oxygen mask. Daylight filtered through window blinds. He'd survived the night. As his eyes adjusted, he realized someone was holding his hand. "Eleanor," he whispered hoarsely. "It's Abigail Chen, Dr. Hayes's nurse," a young woman replied, releasing his hand to pour water. "I've been helping Dr. Foster with your case." Richard sipped through a straw, the cool water soothing his raw throat. "What happened?" "You were systemically poisoned with digitoxin," Abigail explained. "Dr. Hayes prescribed medications that contained increasing doses. When your stroke triggered memories, they escalated the dosage to dangerous levels. Eleanor, the gardener, she saved your life," Abigail said. "When you collapsed, she performed CPR until paramedics arrived. The police have her in protective custody, and Diana, missing, left the resort before the police arrived." Abigail checked his IV. "Dr. Hayes has been arrested. He's cooperating, claiming Diana masterminded everything." Richard closed his eyes briefly, fighting exhaustion. "I need to see my daughter. Natalie's here," Abigail said gently. "She's been in the waiting room all night with her son." "Noah," Richard murmured, remembering Frank's report mentioning Natalie's child, his grandson. "Yes, though he's not doing well himself. The nurses have been monitoring him while they wait for news about you." "His heart condition," Richard realized. "Bring them in, please." Abigail hesitated. "Dr. Foster wanted to limit visitors." "They're my family," Richard insisted, "and I need to see them before Diana tries anything else." Natalie entered cautiously, holding 8-year-old Noah's hand. The boy was pale, with dark circles under his eyes, but Richard immediately recognized Eleanor's amber gaze in his grandson's face. "Mr. Caldwell," Natalie began awkwardly, "I'm glad you're awake. The doctors weren't sure. Please call me Richard," he said, voice still raspy. "And come closer, both of you." They approached the bed, Noah studying Richard with quiet intensity. "You have my grandmother's eyes," the boy said suddenly. "Josephine showed me pictures." Richard's heart skipped. "You know Josephine," Natalie nodded. "She's been a constant presence in our lives, more like family than a friend. She was arrested last night after you collapsed. The police say she's been living under a false identity. She was protecting you," Richard said, "from Diana and my father." "I don't understand any of this," Natalie admitted. Confusion evident. "The police asked about my medallion, about Agnes, about my birth records." Richard took a deep breath. "Natalie, there's no easy way to say this. Josephine is actually Eleanor Bradford. She's your biological mother." Natalie stared, disbelief warring with recognition. "That's impossible. My mother died in childbirth. That's what they wanted everyone to believe." Richard's voice strengthened with urgency. "Eleanor was declared dead by my doctor, Christopher Hayes, on orders from my father and Diana. Agnes helped her escape and then adopted you to keep you safe." "And my father?" Natalie asked, voice barely audible. Richard's eyes filled with tears. "I am." The room fell silent except for the steady beep of monitors. Noah looked between them, processing with a child's directness. "So you're my grandpa?" he asked. A lump formed in Richard's throat. "Yes, Noah, I am." Noah considered this, then nodded as if confirming a suspicion. "That's why Josephine always cut pictures of you from magazines. She said you were important." Natalie sank into a chair, overwhelmed. "This can't be happening." "I know it's a shock," Richard said gently. "I only discovered the truth myself recently. Eleanor, Josephine, has been watching over you all these years, keeping her distance to protect you from my father and Diana." "But why?" Natalie demanded. "Why would they do this? Money, power, control?" Richard sighed. "My father wanted me to marry Diana to merge our family's hotels with the Sinclair fortune. A pregnant gardener's daughter threatened those plans." The door opened as a nurse entered. "I'm sorry to interrupt, but the boy needs his medication." Richard noticed how Noah's breathing had become more labored during their conversation. "Are you okay, Noah?" My heart gets tired sometimes, Noah explained with the matter-of-fact acceptance of a child accustomed to illness. He needs surgery, Natalie said quietly. An experimental procedure our insurance won't cover. Richard reached for Noah's hand, struck by the cruel irony. His grandson suffering from the same congenital heart condition that had killed Edward Caldwell 15 years ago, the grandfather who had rejected him before birth. I'll make sure he gets whatever treatment he needs, Richard promised. Everything I have is yours now. Natalie shook her head, still processing. I don't want your money. I just want the truth. Then we'll start there, Richard agreed. But Noah's health comes first. The nurse checked Noah's oxygen levels with a concerned expression. His SATs are dropping again. We should get him back to pediatrics. As they prepared to leave, Richard called out, Natalie, ask them to bring Eleanor here. I need to speak with her. She paused at the door. Is that really her name, Eleanor? Yes, Eleanor Bradford, the most brilliant botanist I ever knew, and the bravest woman I've ever met. After they left, Richard closed his eyes, conserving strength for what was to come. Diana was still free, and until she was found, none of them were safe. An hour later, the door opened again. Richard opened his eyes, expecting Eleanor, but instead found himself looking at Diana. She was immaculately dressed as always, not a hair out of place despite being a fugitive. You should be dead, she said calmly, closing the door behind her. Sorry to disappoint you, Richard replied, reaching for the call button. Diana moved swiftly, unplugging it from the wall. 33 years of careful planning. Destroyed, because you couldn't just die quietly, like Eleanor was supposed to. Exactly. Diana checked the hallway through the door's window. Edward's plan was elegant. Eliminate the girl, declare the baby dead, problem solved. But that nurse complicated everything by helping her escape. You won't get away with this, Richard said, eyeing the cardiac monitor that would alarm if disconnected. Diana smiled coldly. I already have. For over 3 decades, Christopher is taking the fall. He signed the death certificate. After all, I'm just the grieving wife whose husband was secretly poisoned by his trusted doctor. She reached for his IV line. A final dose of digitoxin, and this time, no gardener to save you. The door burst open. Step away from him, commanded Eleanor, no longer disguised as Josephine, despite her aged appearance. She stood tall, flanked by 2 police officers. Diana's composure finally cracked. You should have stayed dead. The police have been recording this room since Mr. Caldwell regained consciousness, one officer stated, handcuffs ready. Diana Caldwell, you're under arrest for attempted murder and conspiracy. As they led Diana away, still spitting threats, Eleanor approached Richard's bedside cautiously. You came back, Richard whispered. Eleanor's weathered hand found his. I never really left. Eleanor looked different without her gardener's disguise. She'd abandoned the wide-brimmed hat and thick glasses that had hidden her features for so long. Her silver hair, once tucked away, now framed a face lined by years of worry and vigilance. Yet beneath the weathered exterior, Richard could still see traces of the vibrant young woman he'd loved, especially in those amber eyes that had never changed. The police have been questioning me for hours, she said, pulling a chair closer to his hospital bed. I've told them everything. Everything, Richard asked. Eleanor nodded. From the beginning, how Edward summoned me to his study after you left for London, how he offered me money to disappear, and when I refused, threatened not just me but you as well. Her voice remained steady, but her hands trembled. He said accidents could be arranged for stubborn heirs who defied family traditions. My father was capable of many things. But murder! Richard struggled to reconcile this with the stern but principled man he'd known. Power corrupts, Richard. The Caldwell Empire meant everything to him. A gardener's daughter carrying the heir's child threatened everything he'd built. Eleanor's gaze was direct. When I still refused to leave, he had me drugged and taken to the hospital. Christopher declared me in distress and performed an emergency C-section. Richard closed his eyes briefly, the horror of it washing over him, and declared you dead afterwards. Yes, but Agnes, bless her soul, realized something wasn't right. She'd heard Diana instructing Christopher to ensure neither I nor the baby survived the complications. She managed to revive me in the recovery room and smuggled me out during shift change. What about Natalie? Agnes couldn't save her immediately. By the time she returned to the nursery, Natalie had been transferred to state custody as an orphaned newborn. It took Agnes nearly 11 months to track her down and legally adopt her. Eleanor's eyes glistened. I was still recovering, hiding in Agnes's cabin in the mountains, when she finally brought Natalie home. It was the happiest day of my life, and the beginning of decades of fear. Richard reached for her hand. I'm so sorry, Eleanor. If I had known. You couldn't have known. Diana and Christopher made sure of that. She squeezed his fingers. The police found Edward's letter in Diana's safe deposit box. Apparently, he wrote a full confession before his death, detailing the plot against me and how Diana had helped execute it. She kept it as insurance against Christopher ever talking. And now, Christopher's confessed to everything, falsifying my death certificate, helping place Natalie for adoption, and gradually poisoning you over the years on Diana's instructions. Eleanor's expression hardened. Apparently, he's hoping for leniency by cooperating. A knock interrupted them as Dr. Foster entered with Abigail Chen. Your test results are encouraging, Foster announced, checking Richard's chart. The antidote is clearing the digitoxin from your system. Another day or two, and you should be stable enough for discharge. And Noah? Richard asked. My grandson. Foster and Abigail exchanged glances. His condition is concerning, Foster admitted. I've consulted with the pediatric cardiologist. The experimental procedure Natalie mentioned is his best option, but it needs to happen soon. Whatever it costs, Richard said firmly. Make the arrangements immediately. I already took the liberty, Foster replied. Dr. Suarez is the leading surgeon for this procedure. She can fit Noah in next week, but she needs to start the preoperative protocol immediately. Thank you, Richard said, genuinely moved by the doctor's initiative. After Foster and Abigail left, silence fell between Richard and Eleanor, a gulf of 33 years impossible to bridge in a single conversation. Natalie is struggling with all this, Eleanor finally said, finding out her entire life has been built on lies, that the woman she knew as an occasional family friend is actually her mother, that her father is one of the wealthiest men in the country, and that her son needs urgent surgery. Richard added, It's overwhelming. She's strong, Eleanor said with quiet pride. She's always been strong. Agnes and I made sure of that. Richard studied Eleanor's face, seeing years of sacrifice etched into every line. You gave up everything to protect her. Not everything. Eleanor's smile held a lifetime of sorrow. I got to watch her grow up. Even if from a distance, I was there for her first steps. Her school achievements, her heartbreaks, always in the background. Never too close when Agnes died. I created the Josephine identity to stay near her without raising suspicions. And when she got the job at my resort, pure coincidence, though it nearly gave me a heart attack when I found out, I applied for the gardening position to keep watch. Terrified Diana would recognize the resemblance. Eleanor shook her head. I never imagined your stroke would bring everything to the surface. The door opened again, and Natalie entered alone, her expression carefully composed. The doctors are running more tests on Noah, she explained. I wanted to. She trailed off, looking between Richard and Eleanor, clearly uncertain how to navigate this new reality. Eleanor stood. I should give you two some time. No, Natalie interrupted. Please stay, Mother. The word hung in the air, experimental and fragile. Eleanor sank back into her chair, eyes glistening. I've been reading the police reports, Natalie continued, and reviewing the evidence they found in Diana's possession. I still can't believe any of this is real. I understand, Richard said. It's a lot to process. My whole life I've wondered about my birth parents, Natalie said. Agnes told me you were in danger, that you'd given me up to protect me. I always thought it was a kind fiction to ease the pain of abandonment. Nothing about our separation was voluntary, Eleanor assured her. Letting Agnes raise you alone, keeping my distance. It was the hardest thing I've ever done. Natalie brushed away tears. And now Noah. The doctors say his condition is genetic. From your father. She looked at Richard. Richard nodded grimly. Edward had a congenital heart defect. He managed it with medication, but it eventually killed him. I never inherited it, but it seems to have skipped a generation. The irony isn't lost on me, Natalie said bitterly. The man who rejected me before birth passed down the condition threatening my son's life. We're going to save Noah, Richard promised. Dr. Foster is arranging the surgery with the best specialist in the country. I can't accept that, Natalie protested. I don't expect you to suddenly become financially responsible for us just because of biology. It's not about obligation, Richard insisted. It's about making things right. 33 years of wrongs can't be undone. But this, helping Noah, this I can do. Eleanor reached for Natalie's hand. Let him help, sweetheart. Pride won't save Noah's life. Natalie's composure finally broke. My son is dying, and suddenly I have parents I never knew existed. And one of them is a billionaire while the other has been disguised as a gardener watching over me my entire life. How am I supposed to handle any of this? One moment at a time, Eleanor said softly, drawing her daughter into an embrace. Just like we always have. Richard watched them, his heart aching with 3 decades of lost moments. Birthdays, graduations, everyday joys and sorrows he should have shared. As if sensing his thoughts, Eleanor extended her hand to include him in their circle. For the first time since awakening in the hospital, Richard felt something like hope. In the corridor outside, Dr. Foster reviewed the DNA test results, confirming what they already knew. Natalie was indeed the biological daughter of Richard Caldwell and Eleanor Bradford. The genetic markers also confirmed Noah's condition was identical to the one documented in Edward Caldwell's medical history. The evidence against Diana and Christopher was overwhelming. Justice would be served. But first, a little boy needed to be saved. 2 weeks after Richard's cardiac episode, the penthouse conference room of Caldwell Tower buzzed with tension. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the city, but no one admired the vista. All eyes focused on the documents spread across the mahogany table. Richard, still pale but regaining strength daily, sat at the head to his right. Eleanor reviewed evidence files with the careful attention she once gave to botanical specimens. To his left, Frank Malone organized surveillance photos and hospital records. Across from them, District Attorney Victoria Sandoval and 2 detectives prepared for Diana's arraignment hearing. The case against Hayes is ironclad, Sandoval explained. He's cooperating fully, hoping for leniency. But Diana's more complicated. She's hired Thornton's entire criminal defense team. Of course she has, Richard said dryly. She's had decades to prepare contingencies. We have Edward's confession letter, Eleanor reminded them. That directly implicates her in the original conspiracy. And the recording of her hospital admission, Detective Garcia added. Pretty hard to explain away, you should be dead, and a final dose of digitoxin. Frank slid another document forward. Plus, we've traced financial transfers from Diana to Hayes. Regular payments over 30 years disguised as investment consulting. It's compelling, Sandoval acknowledged. But Diana's claiming she was also victimized, that Edward coerced her participation initially, and Hayes blackmailed her afterward. Richard's jaw tightened. No jury will believe that. Don't underestimate her, Eleanor warned. Diana's survived this long by being extraordinarily calculating. The conference room door opened, and Natalie entered, looking exhausted. She'd spent every moment at Noah's hospital bedside since his surgery 3 days earlier. How is he? Eleanor asked immediately. Better. Natalie managed a small smile. His vitals are stabilizing, Doctor. Suarez says the procedure appears successful, but the next 48 hours remain critical. Relief softened the tension in the room. Noah's emergency surgery had been scheduled immediately after Richard's discharge, the experimental procedure representing the boy's best hope for survival. You should be with him, Richard said. This meeting isn't more important than Noah. Actually, it is, Natalie countered, taking a seat. For 8 years, I've lived in constant fear that my son might die because I couldn't afford proper treatment. Diana and Christopher nearly killed you both. I want to see justice done. De Sandoval nodded approvingly. Your testimony regarding the medallion is particularly important. May I see it again? Natalie removed the silver medallion from around her neck. Passing it across the table, the Latin inscription, Amor Vincit Omnia, gleamed under the conference room lights. Richard gave me this on my 20th birthday, Eleanor explained. Inside was a petal from the first flower I ever showed him, a rare orchid I was cultivating in the estate greenhouse. I had it specially made, Richard added. The jeweler recorded the purchase in his ledger, which Frank located. The timing aligns perfectly with Eleanor's account. Sandoval examined the medallion. And Agnes gave this to you, correct? She asked Natalie. On my 16th birthday, she said it belonged to my birth mother and would lead me home someday. Natalie's voice caught. I never fully understood what she meant until now. The district attorney returned the medallion. This piece provides material connection between all parties, combined with the DNA confirmation, Edward's letter, Hayes's confession, and the hospital surveillance records. We have a compelling case. But, Richard prompted, sensing hesitation. But Diana's team will attack Eleanor's credibility, question why she maintained a false identity for decades rather than coming forward. Because Edward threatened to kill Richard if I ever contacted him again, Eleanor said firmly. I believed him capable of it, especially after what he'd already done. We need something definitive that links Diana directly to Edward's original plot, Sandoval stressed. Without that, her coerced victim defense might create reasonable doubt. The room fell silent until Frank cleared his throat. What about Hayes? His statement places Diana at the hospital, instructing him to ensure Eleanor and the baby didn't survive. Hearsay from an admitted conspirator, Sandoval countered. We need... The conference room phone rang, interrupting her. Richard answered, listening intently before hanging up. That was security. Diana's downstairs demanding to see me. Everyone stared in disbelief. That's unexpected, Detective Garcia said. Her attorneys advised no contact. Apparently, she's fired them, Richard replied. She's alone and insisting this is her final opportunity to explain. Sandoval exchanged glances with the detectives. This could be advantageous if she's willing to talk without counsel. It could also be dangerous, Eleanor objected. She's already tried to kill Richard twice. She's been thoroughly searched, Richard assured her. And we'll have security right outside. After brief discussion, they agreed to proceed, with the detectives monitoring from the adjacent room. Before Diana arrived, Sandoval briefed everyone on legally permissible strategies. When Diana finally entered, Richard barely recognized his wife of 20 years. Her designer wardrobe had been replaced by subdued, practical clothing. Her perfect makeup couldn't conceal exhaustion etched across her features. Only her posture remained unchanged. Spine straight, chin lifted in defiance, she froze momentarily upon seeing Eleanor and Natalie, then continued to the empty chair Sandoval indicated. No attorneys, Richard asked. They wanted me to plead insanity, Diana replied with a bitter laugh. Apparently, 30 years of calculated decisions can be dismissed as delusional obsession. Isn't that your best defense? Eleanor asked, studying the woman who had orchestrated her supposed death. Diana's gaze sharpened. I'm not insane, Eleanor. I never was. Every decision was rational, based on protecting my interests that aligned with Edward's initially, then became my own. Those interests nearly cost multiple lives, Natalie interjected, voice tight with controlled anger. Diana assessed her coolly. You really do look extraordinarily like your mother. It's remarkable Edward didn't anticipate that complication. Why are you here, Diana? Richard demanded. Closure. She reached into her purse slowly, allowing security to verify she wasn't retrieving a weapon. She withdrew a small flash drive. Edward's complete confession. Richard eyed it skeptically. We already have his letter. The letter is abbreviated. This contains his full video confession, recorded 3 days before his fatal heart attack. Diana placed the drive on the table. He was terrified of dying with his sins unconfessed, but too cowardly to face legal consequences. Why would you keep this? Eleanor asked. It incriminates you. Insurance against Christopher, and leverage over Sinclair Industries. Edward implicated Diana Sinclair senior management in several illegal activities. Diana's smile was cold. I was protecting my investments. And now you're offering it as, what? A plea bargain? Richard asked. No, Diana said simply. I know I'm going to prison. This ensures I won't go alone. The Sinclairs, who pushed Edward into our arrangement and financed the cover-up, deserve to fall too. Why would Edward record this? Sandoval questioned, breaking her silence. Diana's expression darkened. Guilt. Partly, but mostly fear of hell, Edward became ridiculously religious after his first heart attack. thought confession would save his eternal soul while preserving his earthly reputation. She turned to Richard. He never regretted separating you from Eleanor. He genuinely believed she was beneath you socially, but he was haunted by ordering her death and the baby's disappearance, called it his one true sin. Diana addressed Eleanor directly. I never had Edward's moral qualms. For me, it was simple strategy. Richard was the path to controlling Caldwell hospitality. You and the baby were obstacles. I would make the same decision again. The room fell silent at her cold calculation. You never loved me, Richard finally said. Not once in 20 years. I respected you, Diana countered. Your business acumen, your vision, love was irrelevant. Natalie stood abruptly. While you're being so candid, answer me one thing. Did you know about my son's condition? That he inherited Edward's heart defect? Diana met her gaze unflinchingly. Yes, I had you monitored periodically. When Noah was diagnosed, I considered it cosmic justice. Edward's genetic flaw threatening his unwanted grandchild's life. Natalie's hands clenched. You knew a child was suffering and did nothing. I owed you nothing, Diana replied simply. My arrangement was with Edward. Once he died, my only concern was protecting my position. Something in her tone caught Eleanor's attention. What arrangement exactly? Edward promised to transfer controlling interest in Caldwell hospitality to me if I helped eliminate the Eleanor problem and ensured Richard married into the Sinclair family. Diana's expression soured. A promise he later modified, giving me only 20%, hence my insurance policies. Richard stared at his wife of 2 decades, this stranger he'd never truly known. All of this, our entire marriage, was a business transaction. Of course. Diana seemed genuinely surprised by his shock. I assumed you knew on some level. Our compatibility was too perfect. Our business visions too aligned. She shrugged. You got a capable CFO and companion. I got wealth and power, an equitable arrangement. With remarkable dignity, Eleanor rose. I think we've heard enough, Detective Garcia. The door opened immediately as the detectives entered. Diana Caldwell, Garcia began. You have the right to remain silent. As Diana was led away, she paused beside Richard. For what it's worth, poisoning you wasn't personal. You were just becoming a liability as memories resurfaced. That's supposed to make me feel better, Richard asked incredulously. No, she replied, just completing the transaction with full disclosure. After she departed, the room remained silent until Natalie's phone rang. She answered anxiously, then closed her eyes in relief. Noah's awake, she announced. He's asking for me. Go, Richard and Eleanor said simultaneously. As the others gathered their materials, Richard and Eleanor found themselves alone for the first time since the hospital. 33 years, Eleanor murmured, all because of Edward's pride and Diana's ambition. Richard took her weathered hand. We can't reclaim those years, but perhaps we can still build something from here. Noah's recovery comes first, Eleanor said pragmatically. Then helping Natalie adjust to all this, Richard nodded. One step at a time, together. From the office window, they watched Diana being escorted into a police vehicle below, her posture still rigid with defiance. Love conquers all, Eleanor translated the medallion's inscription softly. It took 33 years, but perhaps it finally has. 6 months later, the Azul resort was transformed. Gone were the sleek minimalist furnishings and corporate atmosphere. In their place, lush botanical displays created intimate spaces for relaxation and healing. The resort's expansive gardens, once merely decorative, now featured medicinal plants with educational placards detailing their properties and uses. Richard Caldwell stood on the main terrace, watching guests explore the newly completed Botanical Research Center. The state-of-the-art facility occupied what had once been the resort's exclusive spa, now repurposed to honor Eleanor's lifelong passion. Grandfather. Noah's voice rang out as he ran across the lawn. His cheeks flushed with healthy color. 6 months post-surgery, he showed no signs of the frail boy who had once struggled for breath. Mom says the new greenhouse deliveries are here. Richard smiled, still marveling at how quickly he'd adapted to being called grandfather. Let's go check them. Shall we? Noah grabbed his hand, pulling him toward the delivery area. Dr. Suarez said my heart is super strong now, even stronger than other kids. That's wonderful news, Richard replied. matching his grandson's pace. After Noah's successful surgery, Dr. Suarez had joined the board of the newly established Caldwell Heart Foundation, which funded advanced cardiac treatments for children whose families couldn't afford them. They reached the greenhouse where Natalie directed workers unloading rare plant specimens. She'd blossomed in her new role as the center's research director, her innate botanical knowledge now supported by formal education. She'd enrolled in university to complete the degree she'd always dreamed of. "Dad," she greeted Richard, the term still new enough to make them both pause momentarily. "The Malaysian specimens look healthy, but we should get Mom to check them." "I'm already here." Eleanor appeared from the orchid section, clipboard in hand. She'd abandoned her Josephine disguise but kept her practical gardening clothes, refusing the trappings of wealth that now surrounded her. "The Rafflesia needs immediate attention. It's showing stress from shipping." Richard watched his reunited family work together, their shared botanical passion creating a bridge across their years apart. When he'd proposed converting Azul into a botanical research center, they'd embraced the idea wholeheartedly. The facility now served triple duty: luxury resort, research institution, and educational center focused on medicinal plants. The transition hadn't been without challenges. The business world had reeled from Diana's arrest and subsequent conviction. Christopher Hayes had received a reduced sentence for his cooperation, but still faced 15 years for his role in the conspiracy. Diana, refusing any deals, had been sentenced to 30 years, one for each year of her deception. Richard had restructured Caldwell Hospitality, divesting many properties but retaining Azul as the flagship of a new enterprise focused on wellness and healing. The corporate board had initially resisted, but Richard's controlling interest, and the threat of a complete public airing of the Caldwell-Sinclair conspiracy, had silenced opposition. Mr. Caldwell, Abigail Chen, now the center's medical liaison, approached with a tablet. "The conference call with the Brazilian ethnobotanical team is scheduled in 20 minutes. "Thank you." "Abigail," Richard nodded. "And how are the pediatric scholarship applications coming?" "We've received over 200 candidates. Dr. Foster is reviewing the medical cases personally." Abigail smiled. "Your foundation is making a real difference." After she departed, Eleanor joined Richard, her weathered hand finding his. "You're quiet today." "Just thinking about how much has changed," he admitted. 6 months ago I was dying, poisoned by my wife, with no knowledge of my daughter or grandson. And now," Richard gestured to the thriving center around them, "now I have everything I never knew I was missing." Eleanor's expression softened. "We can't reclaim those lost years." "No," Richard agreed, "but we can ensure Noah and Natalie never lose another day." He paused. "Are you sure about tomorrow? It's not too late to keep things private." "I'm sure," Eleanor said firmly. "After 33 years of hiding, I want to stand in the sun." The next morning, the central garden of Azul Resort was transformed for an intimate ceremony. Chairs arranged in a semicircle faced a simple arbor woven with Eleanor's favorite flowers. Security ensured privacy, with only close friends and trusted staff in attendance. Noah, dressed in a miniature suit, proudly performed his role as ring-bearer. Natalie, serving as matron of honor, adjusted her mother's simple lace wrap before taking her place beside the arbor. Dr. Foster and Frank Malone, who had become unlikely friends through their shared investigation, sat in the front row alongside Abigail and key members of the research staff. When the music began, a classical piece Eleanor had loved in her youth, Richard turned to watch her approach. She wore no bridal gown, just an elegant ivory dress that complemented her silver hair. She carried a bouquet of the same rare orchids she'd been sketching when they first met nearly 34 years ago. As she reached him, Richard took her hands. The justice of the peace smiled at the couple. "Family and friends, we gathered today not for a beginning, but for a renewal." Richard and Eleanor's love story was interrupted 33 years ago. Today, they reclaim that story and write a new chapter. Richard had insisted on writing their vows himself, refusing professional help as he spoke. His voice carried clearly across the garden. "Eleanor, when we met, I was heir to a fortune, but poor in spirit. You showed me beauty in the simplest bloom, taught me that true wealth lay in connection, not possession." He squeezed her hands. "We lost 33 years, but I refuse to mourn them today. Instead, I celebrate finding you again, finding our daughter, discovering our grandson. I vow to cherish every day we have left, to protect our family as I failed to do before, and to love you with every breath remaining to me." Eleanor blinked back tears as she replied, "Richard, for 33 years I watched our daughter grow from a distance, always searching for your eyes in her face, your determination in her spirit. I lived in shadows to keep her safe, but never stopped loving either of you." Her voice strengthened. "Today, I step into the light. I vow to stand beside you openly, proudly, to help heal the wounds of our past, and to cultivate our future together. Day by day, just as we tend these gardens." They exchanged rings, simple platinum bands engraved with their Latin motto, Amor vincit omnia, as the justice pronounced them husband and wife. Noah cheered loudly, making everyone laugh. The celebration afterward was joyful but subdued, with Noah eventually falling asleep in a garden chair. Exhausted from excitement as twilight fell, lanterns illuminated the paths, creating a magical atmosphere. Richard found Eleanor near the medicinal herb garden, gazing at the stars emerging above. "Happy?" he asked, wrapping his arms around her from behind. "More than I ever imagined possible," she admitted, leaning into his embrace. "Though part of me still fears this is temporary, that I'll wake up as Josephine again, watching from a distance." "No more watching from a distance," Richard promised. "No more hiding." They stood quietly, savoring the moment, until Natalie joined them, Noah drowsy in her arms. "I think someone needs his bed," she said softly. Eleanor reached to smooth Noah's dark hair. "I still can't believe we're all together." "Believe it," Richard said firmly. "The Caldwell legacy is no longer hotels or fortune. It's this, our family, our research, the lives we'll help through the foundation." As they walked together toward the residential wing, Richard reflected on the journey that had brought them here. His stroke, triggered by years of poisoning, had broken the walls containing his memories. Diana's meticulous plan had ultimately failed because of one simple truth: love couldn't be erased, only temporarily buried. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. There were still legal matters to settle: Diana's appeals to contest, foundations to establish. Natalie had her studies, Noah his recovery, and the center its research goals. But tonight, walking beneath the stars with 3 generations of his family, Richard finally understood what Eleanor's medallion had promised all those years ago. Love had indeed conquered all, even time itself,